So trauma is a constriction in your emotional functioning or in a person's emotional functioning where they actually become narrowed and constricted and harder. In other words, trauma is not what happened to you. Trauma is what happened inside you as a result of what happened.
When I think about trauma and the work that I do nationally, we talk about trauma as being pervasive. And we'll do a little bit of the prevalence information, pervasive. What we've discovered is 98% of the people who cross the threshold of a behavioral health organization, either with addictions or mental health challenges, have experienced significant trauma in their life at some point. If we do not look at trauma, we are not going to make a difference in this country in mental health, in addictions, and in primary care.
And in my experience, we have trauma in many different ways. Physical, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual trauma, for example. Sometimes we have an experience that is deeply traumatic to us that might not seem or be traumatic to another person.
For us to be wounded, it does not require something terrible to happen. So trauma does not have to involve something terrible happening. Usually when we think of trauma, we think of terrible things. And yeah, a lot of terrible things do happen to children. And I'm sure have to some people in this room. But it doesn't take that. It just needs your needs not being met for you to be wounded.
If what you've heard so far feels uncomfortably familiar, stay with me. The next part might explain why your reactions sometimes feel too much, and why they're not your fault. Once you see the real cause, it's like someone finally turned on the light in a dark room you've been living in for years.
I want to share one that happened in my life that was so significant, but again, many people wouldn't even identify it as trauma. When I was in kindergarten, we had recess, and I had to put on my tennis shoes and tie them. I didn't know how to tie my shoes. And I actually remember, like it was yesterday, what it felt like to sit in the back of that classroom. I can actually remember to this day the aisleway, the desks, the teacher standing in front of the room. It felt like everyone else knew how to tie their shoes. And I sat there in total fear. The teacher, I'm assuming very well-meaning, sent me home with a board with 2 shoes glued to it. This is back in the day when we walked home from school. I remember carrying that board and walking down the sidewalk. I can remember this like it was yesterday too. And I was reciting to myself over and over and over again, I am so stupid. I am so stupid. I am so stupid. And I remember that as a profound moment in my life because it was at that moment that I decided at a very deep level that I was stupid. That stayed with me all the way through school. And if I'm more honest with you, actually all the way up until right around the time I was 40, when I recognized that that was a false belief, not a reality.
There's something about stories that just takes us there. So like, what is a story if not an account of something? And that accounting, that storytelling, we're all doing it all the time in our head. I mean, this is part of what it is to be human. You know, there's Elie Wiesel, he's the Holocaust survivor and a human rights activist and writer. He has this quote, he says, God created humans because God loves stories. We are like the way that story comes into the world. We are storytelling creatures, like fish live in the sea. We live in stories. The stories in here, the counts that we have of everything in our life. If we have a story that doesn't map well onto what is actually going on in life, stories that we developed as a young child in really hard circumstances, stories that don't serve us anymore, stories that aren't even accurate anymore, are we stuck with that? Is that our reality? As soon as we start recognizing that our stories are not reality, we become the storytellers of our own life.
So imagine this adolescent who comes to see you and he or she can tell you what's going on in their lives. and you express acceptance of them, and you express understanding and appreciation for who they are. You say, yeah, that's really hard. And then that person goes home into that same traumatizing situation. Okay? Now imagine that same adolescent who's experiencing the same trauma and every day has to go back to that same situation, but you're not in their lives. And there's nobody in their life to say, geez, that's hard. I'm so sorry. I get it. But you know what? It's not your fault. It's not you. You don't deserve it.
Depending on when and where you grew up, you might have been told that it's not okay to feel. Or maybe in your family system, no one talked about emotions. That is emotional trauma. Anytime it is not honored and recognized that it's okay for us to feel, that can be emotional trauma.
By now, you might already be thinking about moments from your own life. Here's the thing. Awareness is the first crack in the wall trauma builds around you. And in the next few minutes, I'm going to share how to step through that crack so you can finally feel more free in your own skin.
Trauma gives you pain. It gives you a wound that might be some scar tissue over it, but the wound is never healed, actually. There's pain there. And then that's pain that you need to escape. Trauma comes from a Greek word for wound. Literally. So trauma is a wound. If I wounded you physically, like stab you or slash your skin, that wound would heal by forming a scar. That scar tissue is going to be less flexible and less resilient than your natural tissue would be. There'd be a hardness there. There'd be a constriction there, tightness. That's physical trauma. Same with emotional trauma. So where you were wounded, there's a scar there, which is harder to penetrate. It's less resilient. It's tighter. It's constricted.
This is a recording device, and it records everything that we've ever experienced, and it reacts to what we've experienced in the way that it reacted in the past. And so that's how we live the past. So new circumstances arise, but we carry this old programming. In the East, they call that karma. So karma isn't what happens to you. Karma comes from you. Karma is the emergence in the present moment of all that past programming that meets a present moment circumstance. So how do you change that? Well, you've got to get a perspective on your perspective. And people can and do get better if they learn how to meditate skillfully and they learn how to explore their past programming and deconstruct that past programming and construct new ideas and conceptions of self.
So healing trauma is really about creating a safe space internally to begin to become aware of what's happening, not outside of us, but inside of us. And look at the possibility that we can actually be present with ourselves enough to actually heal this trauma. In other words, we can't go back and change the past, but we can change our experience of the past, and we can begin to become aware of how we can be present with ourselves here and now rather than getting pulled back. The seduction of the past trauma can pull us back there. So we're going to learn how to be really present and create the internal safety necessary for us to start to actually heal the traumatic experience.
Once we begin to see trauma this way, not as something that happened to us, but as something that shaped us from the inside, a different question naturally arises. If this wound wasn't our fault, if it formed quietly, early, and without words, then how did we survive it? How did the mind adapt? How did the nervous system learn to cope when being open felt unsafe? Because most people didn't just carry pain, they developed ways to protect themselves from feeling it. And those protections didn't come from weakness. They came from intelligence. from survival. In the next part, Dr. Gabor Maté explores how the brain learns to guard our most vulnerable places, and why the very defenses that once kept us safe can later keep us from growing.
A tree doesn't grow where it's hard and thick, does it? It goes where it's soft and green and vulnerable. So vulnerability is absolutely essential for growth. And for vulnerability, you gotta let go of those defense.
How do we uncover those? Because I feel that, and maybe this is something to address, it's that, at least what I find is that a lot of our beliefs that we have about ourselves and about others are wired to try and make us feel safe to some degree. So I believe, and I'm hypothetically saying this, I believe that I am right in my opinion because that makes me feel safe and secure. But often to unearth a wound, we have to be okay with the vulnerability of saying, well, maybe I'm not right. Maybe this response is coming from some wound that I gained in the past. So for example, when you were speaking about your marriage, you sparked something for me. I found that a lot of the love I received when I was younger was then followed by guilt. So when I received love when I was younger, the idea was if I couldn't reciprocate with that level of love, I'd be made to feel guilty that I didn't love someone enough. And I found that I would repeat that in my own relationship with my wife, where I would overlove, and if she didn't match that level of love, I would then make her feel guilty. And it took me years to really discover that pattern, and that's just one tiny pattern. And whether that's trauma or a difficult experience is a different conversation, but the idea that spotting that pattern only came from me saying, well, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe me wanting to make someone feel guilty is not the right thing. How do we assess that? How do we gain the vulnerability in safety to create that future stability? Does that make sense?
Well, it makes absolute sense because vulnerability itself is absolutely essential for growth. So vulnerability, the word itself comes from the Latin word vulnerare, to wound. So vulnerability is our capacity to be wounded. Now, the reality is that as human beings, we're all vulnerable from conception until death. But when we're hurt in childhood and the vulnerability is too painful to bear, we will try and shut down our vulnerability. And for example, by being right. Because if I'm right, then I'm powerful and I can't be assailed anymore, you know? But when we do that, we stop growing. Everything in nature grows only where it's vulnerable. So crustacean animal like a crab inside a hard shell, it can't grow. It has to molt and make itself very vulnerable to be able to grow. A tree doesn't grow where it's hard and thick, does it? It goes where it's soft and green and vulnerable. So vulnerability is absolutely essential for growth. And for vulnerability, you gotta let go of those defenses, such as being right, that you developed as a child in order to protect yourself from the pain. So that's why we talk about growing pains, because vulnerability is necessary for growth. Without vulnerability, there is no growth.
Wow, what you just said, that is so beautiful. You just said vulnerability is our capacity to be wounded.
That's what it means, literally.
Yeah, that's an incredible definition of the word. I think we hear so many definitions of vulnerability, but that vulnerability, I'm just going to say that again. Everyone write that down. Vulnerability is our capacity to be wounded. How do we develop our capacity? So actually, let's go back to childhood. We'll come back to that. So if we go to childhood, what are the things happening currently that you perceive? And I know you talk about this in your new book, The Myth of Normal. By the way, what is happening in our childhood, in society? I guess when you say things are not happening to us, there are still environmental impacts that are imprinting the potential for this wound to grow. What are some of those things that are distorting our development in unhealthy ways in childhood?
There are two things. One is obvious, like when the children are mistreated, maltreated, abused, sexually, physically, emotionally, when there's violence in the family or a parent is caught up in addiction or where there's a rancorous divorce and a lot of conflict in the home, children are just wounded, period. But it's more insidious and more ubiquitous than that because children have certain basic needs. Now, if you want to understand a zebra or a whale, where would you study those creatures? In a zoo or an aquarium, or out there in nature? Same with human beings. So you have to actually look at what are the evolutionary determined needs of human beings as inculcated or instilled in us through our evolutionary history. And so we evolved with certain needs. There used to be this belief that children are what are called a tabula rasa, an empty slate. You can just write whatever you want on it, program the child in any way you want. That used to be the prevailing belief. It's not the truth. Children are born with not only just certain needs, but certain inherent expectations. So, to give an example, your lungs are an inherent expectation for oxygen because they developed in response to oxygen. If there'd be no oxygen in the environment, we'd have no lungs. In the same way with the human child, it has certain inherent expectations. And you can wound kids not just by maltreating them, but by not meeting those expectations. When I say expectation, I don't mean a conscious expectation. I mean an expectation inherent in the organism. So children need unconditional loving acceptance by multiple adult caregivers, which is how we evolved in hunter-gatherer groups and lived that way for millions and hundreds of thousands of years. Children have a need not to have to work to make the relationship with the parents work. So children need rest from having to struggle to make the relationship functional. So they don't have to be pretty or cute or compliant or clever or successful or any of that stuff. They just need to be, and they don't have to work at getting the parents to accept them. That's an essential need of the child. When I say essential, I mean if it's not met, that'll distort child development. The third need is really crucial, and in our society, it's hardly ever met, which is the child needs the freedom to experience all the emotions that nature has endowed her or him with. So we have certain brain circuits for anger, for love, for play, for lust, for seeking, curiosity. Then with other animals, we share them with bear cubs and puppies and little whales, elephant. They need to develop because they're there for a reason. Evolution gave it to us. In our society, parents are often advised and taught to suppress certain emotional experiences on the part of the child. That's a wound to the child, which distorts their development and has significant implications for health later on. The fourth essential need, is free play out in nature. Free play, spontaneous, creative, imaginative play. But that's essential for healthy brain development. We share that with other animals. Baby elephants play, bear cubs play, puppies play, lion cubs play. Crucial for brain development. We know that now. In our society, we put cognitive development way ahead of play, and we deprive our children of play by giving them gadgets, which deprives them of imagination. So we're actually undermining their brain development and their healthy unfolding as human beings. So children can be wounded, not just by bad things happening to them, but by their needs not being met. And in our society, when you ask about the environmental conditions that undermine health and child development, these environmental conditions in our society are inimical to healthy human unfoldment. No wonder we have so many children in trouble with anxiety and ADHD and depression, and the rate of childhood suicide is going up, and the number of kids being medicated with heavy-duty medications, multiplicity of medications, is going up. Why? Because the conditions for healthy development are less and less available to them, not because parents don't love their kids, not because they're not trying to do their best, but because of the conditions under which parenting takes place in this society.
Yeah, and what would you say those are? Obviously, there's the love part which you spoke about, but when a child is going through something like that, so let's talk about loss, because I think that's a big one, right? Like whether it's losing a parent or losing a puppy, as you said, or even if it's not losing a parent to death, it's losing a parent to a divorce. It's,
for example. Yeah.
Correct, yeah. So grief and loss doesn't have to mean end of life. It can be everything.
Exactly.
Or a loss of a country. What are the steps that someone should take in order to help guide through anyone through loss, not just a child?
Well, interestingly enough, when I spoke about these brain circuits that we share with other mammals, for play and for loving and seeking. We also have a brain circuit for panic and grief. Why do we have that? Because life brings loss. And so grief is essential for life, because grief is coming to terms with the fact that something is gone, is not going to come back. So when a child experiences grief, and I said that the need of the child is to be able to experience all the emotions. They need to be able to experience the grief as well.
Mm.
And it doesn't matter whether from adult eyes we see that loss as major or minor. It's a question of how is the child experiencing it. And for a small child, even what looks like small losses can be very painful.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then we don't make the child wrong for it. We don't say, get over it. There's nothing wrong. Think of all the other children who are suffering. All that kind of relativistic, shaming stuff. We say, oh, it really hurts, doesn't it? You really wish grandpa would be here with you. You really wish mom and dad weren't leaving each other. It hurts. In other words, you just validate their emotions. By doing so, you help them accept the loss, and you help them move through, and you help them learn that they can endure difficult emotions without having to become falling to pieces.